LED error codes are the way that your controller will communicate from your system when you are having issues. There's a few codes that you'll want to know. The all-level LED blinking. That LED will blink when your system is already level, so you only need to deploy the system if you are looking for stabilization. The on-off, jacks down, and park brake. So that is a communication error. You could have a disconnected wire at your control panel, or you could have a chewed through wire or damage somewhere. The park brake LED blinking, this one's a little obvious, so you'll need to engage your park brake before you try to operate that system. The wait and on-off LED blinking, so that's a transmission error. You either have loss of communication to the transmission or your system's not sensing when that transmission is in neutral. All LEDs are blinking, so this is the program mode when you're trying to calibrate that 0 point into your controller. Left, right, front, rear, and all level LEDs are blinking. So that's all the LEDs inside that diamond, and that is the controller telling you that you have too much of an excessive slope for the system to achieve level. So you either have to repark the unit, or your controller became unmounted or is not mounted correctly, and you need to remedy that by mounting it correctly with that arrow pointing to the front of the unit. That controller is looking for level within 0.3 degrees, and that's when the system will tell you that level has been achieved. If you are outside of or larger than 5 degrees out of slope, this system will not be able to level your unit. The way LED is blinking, so that is the controller telling you that it's trying to take measurements and calibrate to become ready for leveling your system. Low voltage LED blinking, so at that safety interconnect harness, it's measuring if you have proper voltage coming off of your battery. If you do not have good voltage, you will not be able to run this system. Left, right, and all level LEDs are blinking. Your system has been in retract for over 4 minutes, and your bobber switch or your pressure switch has not sensed that your jacks are in their retracted position. So for the power down spring return system, you'll want to check the fluid in that reservoir and make sure that that float switch is functioning properly. And then the power down, power up system, you check that pressure switch, make sure that it's engaged and that you don't have fluid leaking anywhere on your system. Along with using the error codes that the controller will display on the touchpad through those LED lights, you'll also have to troubleshoot a few of the issues. So here we have a chart listing the problem, probable cause, and the solution. To start off with, the system will not turn on and the on-off indicator light does not illuminate. So your touchpad's not getting any power. Make sure that you have your coach ignition in the run position. And then controllers have been on for more than 4 minutes. So this controller does have a timeout, and it will time out that touchpad after 4 minutes, so you'll have to cycle start your engine. Next, we have jacks that will not extend, pump is not running. So if you have low voltage on that battery, you should be getting an error code at your touchpad letting you know that you don't have the proper voltage to run this system. So make sure that your coach's battery is being charged by that engine running, and if you're still not getting that proper voltage, you might want to go back and check your battery to make sure it's still in good condition. Next, the jacks will not extend, the pump is running. So you'll want to go and check to make sure that your fluid level is at that fill line in the reservoir. You could have a dump valve open if you recently performed a manual override. You could have a faulty dump valve, so if your pump is running but you're still not getting liquid through there, you'll want to go check that dump valve and make sure that the valve is clean itself. Or lastly, you might want to check that pump and make sure it's actually moving that fluid through the system. Next, all jacks will not retract or will not fully retract. You could have a few issues here. Little to no fluid in the reservoir. Obviously, you'll refill that fluid with the Dextron 3 or Mercron 5 or whatever hydraulic fluid you already have present in your system per the manufacturer. Next, you could have a faulty dump valve, so you'll want to test your dump valve and make sure it's not clogged and that coil is working. If it's not, you'll replace the dump valve. Next, the electronic signal is lost between the control and the valve coils. You'll trace the wires for voltage or loss of signal, and you'll replace the necessary wires. If you don't find any wires that have a disconnected signal and there's no issues with the wiring harness, you'll have to replace the control pad. On this next page, we have any single jack will not retract. This one also has a few issues that could be happening. You could have a hose damaged or disconnected. You would replace or reconnect that hose. The faulty leg valve or coil, again, you'll want to check that valve and check that coil. Electronic signal lost between the control and the leg valve. You can attempt to retract the jacks in manual mode, and if you are successful, you might have a faulty control pad. So if not, you can test for voltage drop between the controller and jack valve, and then you'll have to repair that bad wiring as necessary. Or if you have a power down spring return system, you could have a broken spring, and this is easily seen visually, and you'll have an external spring broken. For the internal spring, you just won't have that jack moving back up, but you should be able to move it manually. So for the internal spring, you'll have to replace the whole jack. For the external spring, that jack can have its spring replaced independently. Jacks down, light does not go out when all jacks are retracted. Again, you're going to want to check your fluid levels. And if you have a power down, power up system, you'll want to check that the pressure switch is working and functioning properly. Next, we have the alarm sounds and the jacks down light starts flashing while traveling. So your controller is sensing that your jacks or that fluid level is lowered for the power down spring return. And then the retract pressure switch is not working on the power down, power up system. So jacks bleed down after being extended or retracted. You could have air in the system and you would need to do the purge procedure to remedy that. And then next, you could have a faulty piston seal on the power down, power up system, and you would have to replace the jack if you have that jack fail the piston seal test. For part replacement, with this system being over 30 years old, there's going to be a few things that are obsolete. Specifically, the manual touchpad and the metal tank and its manifold. If you are trying to replace these parts, you will not be able to order them. And for all other parts, you'll want to call into our parts department or check the LCI website and see if those parts are available. Now, before we continue, let's jump over to our mock-up and perform a few of the tests that I talked about during troubleshooting. Here at our mock-up, you can get a really good visual of everything that's going on with our system. So let's put our safety gear on and get started. Since we're working on a hydraulic system, it's always good to wear gloves to protect yourself from that hydraulic fluid getting all over your hands. And always safety glasses. Now when you're coming to check the electrical components, a good place to start is at this blade fuse that goes from the power source to the solenoid. It's housed in this little compartment, and it's easy to see if that fuse needs replaced. It's a 10 amp fuse. The next thing that I want to show you how to test is that bobber switch. This is that float switch that senses when that hydraulic fluid is in the reservoir or not. And with ours, you can tell that our fill line sticker is a little offset, and that will happen with age of the system. You want your hydraulic fluid within 3/4 inches of the top of that reservoir. If you have enough fluid, you can go ahead and remove your switch to test its functioning. So we'll disconnect the wire harness, grab a few of our tools. We have an adjustable wrench. Sometimes you can loosen it without a countersink, but normally you'll want two to hold one, the bottom nut in place, and then you can loosen the top. Be careful not to damage that rubber grommet. You might want to get a pick tool and gently pry that grommet out. Now this will be messy because it is submerged in that hydraulic fluid. You can grab a paper towel and rest it on your work surface. Grab your multimeter. Make sure that your terminals are plugged in and you're going to switch it to test the continuity. So you'll take your terminals from your multimeter and place it in the end of this float switch. Since we're checking continuity, it doesn't matter which one you place it in. And when you move that bobber switch, your terminals should be sensing the open and close of the circuit. And then when your multimeter is sensing that continuity, it will open and close the circuit, and that shows that your float switch is working. So on our multimeter, when the bobber switch is in the float position, that means that the hydraulic fluid will be pushing it up. It reads no continuity, and when that bobber switch goes down, it will have a open circuit and it will read 0.541 for the voltage. As you open and close that, the measurements should switch back and forth, and that will tell you if your float switch is working properly or not. Now we can reinstall our float switch and continue checking the system. So make sure that rubber grommet gets inserted. Make sure that washer is on top, and when you pull this up, you should be able to tighten this nut straight onto that float switch. And then I'm using an adjustable wrench and a 15/16 inch wrench. Just tighten it enough so that grommet is snug and that it's not going to leak the hydraulic fluid. And then reconnect your electrical connections. This brown wire will always go to that float switch, or if you are working on a power return system, it will be going to that pressure switch. Now we can come over and check our dump valves and those coils. So here we have the leg valves and the dump valve. So this dump valve, if your system's having difficulty retracting or extending the jacks, you can come to check the dump valve. This should be all the way tightened. You can see you can turn it counterclockwise and open the valve manually. This is a sign that the dump valve is open, and you could have left it open doing a manual override procedure. To remedy this, you would just simply close this. And that's how that dump valve is closed. But since we have this cap off, we can disconnect this coil, remove the coil, and we can test this coil now. So to test the coil, you'll begin by inserting a screwdriver into the center of this coil. You'll take some wires and insert them into the terminals of the battery. One side will always be positive. Being careful with these wires to make sure that they don't touch. The other side negative. And then when you insert these wires into the wire harness of this coil, it should activate that coil and hold on to the screwdriver. Make sure you disconnect your wires from that battery. And now that we tested the coil, we know that it's not the coil that's malfunctioning, and we need to check the valve for any blockage. Let's replace this coil. Reconnect our wire harness and replace that cap at the top of the coil. These caps are not orderable separate from the coil system. Let's check one of the leg valves for a clog. To check the leg valve, you'll take your 7/8 wrench and loosen it. To test the coil and the valve, you can unscrew this top plastic cap, remove the coil from the valve, And then take a 7/8 inch wrench and loosen that valve. Going slow. Since we have our dump valve engaged, it's not going to leak hydraulic fluid. And now you can take a good look at the inside of this valve and see if there's anything clogging the system. You can manually activate the valve and visually see that hydraulic fluid move on the inside when you press that button. And that tells you that the valve is opening and closing. And it moves properly, so we can reinstall ours onto the system, making sure not to cross the threading of the valve system because that can cause a leak. Retighten the valve, and then reinstall the coil. Again, this plastic cap is not orderable on its own, so if you lose it, you will have to order a whole new leg valve system. I'm going to extend the jacks on the system so you can get a good look of what the manual override will look like when you're performing it on your system. Now that we have our jacks fully extended, we can perform the manual override in case of a failure that you cannot solve on your own. To do that, you'll open up this dump valve that we mentioned earlier, take the cap off and set it to the side. This is where you can manually open this valve. So you'll turn that counterclockwise, open the valve up all of the way. Now that the dump valve is open, you'll push one of the buttons on top of the leg valves. These can be pressed at the same time, or they can be pressed to retract individually. The leg valves are marked on the manifold of what jacks they correlate to. This is the front jack, this is the roadside rear jack, and this is the curbside rear jack. We'll start by retracting our front jacks, and then we'll move on to the rest. You can do them individually or all together. So we'll retract our front jack, and then we'll do our rear jacks together. To finish up the manual override, you'll want to re-close that dump valve. You'll turn that clockwise, and then replace that plastic cap, also turning it clockwise. Make sure you tighten down the plastic cap because that cap is what holds the coil down on top of that valve. If you're suspicious that the rod guide seal might be leaking, it's easy to visually check if there's pooling hydraulic fluid on this foot pad here. A little bit of moisture is okay from the hydraulic fluid, but if it is pooling in this pad, that is a sign that your rod seal is leaking and it needs replaced. That concludes the testing that we can perform on the spring return system, and now we're going to move on to the power return system. Here is our pressure switch. When you disconnect the wire harness, your jacks down light should light up on the touchpad. To test this, you can put a wire in the end and make that open circuit a closed circuit, and that should cycle your light back off. If this test works, then it is a sign that your wiring harness is not damaged and that does not need replaced, and you need to replace the pressure switch. I mentioned on the spring return system about checking the foot pad for leaking hydraulic fluid, and that's the sign that the rod guide seal is leaking and needs replaced. For the power return system, it's a little bit of a different test to check that piston seal. So since that seal is inside and attached to the actual piston, so you'll take your wrenches and remove the extend port hydraulic hose. Be ready with your paper towel because a few drops of hydraulic fluid should leak out. Now, since we have a good view while we're over at the manifold, you should perform the manual override procedure by turning the motor at the top and making sure that your corresponding leg valve is open to this jack. Since that directional valve is always in the retract position, it will create the hydraulic pressure at the bottom of the jack, trying to return the jack to the retracted position, and that will force a little bit of pressure on that hydraulic seal on the inside. If you have more than just a few drops coming out of this from the pressure, then it's a sign that your piston seal is damaged on the inside and it needs replaced. When you're done, replace your hydraulic hose. Use your wrenches, one to hold that hose fitting in place and the other to tighten the hose down. Both of the power gear leveling systems have manual overrides, but the power down, power up system looks a little different than the spring return. So here at the top of the motor, we have the manual override nut, and it takes a 7/16 inch socket, and you'll use a cordless drill, not an impact because that can damage your system. And you'll turn that clockwise because it's a unidirectional motor. And with our directional switch always set to retract, whenever you press one of these leg valves at the top and turn that motor with your drill, it will retract the jack. So you can do this as far as you need to retract them. You can do them individually, or you can retract the jacks all at the same time by pressing each of the buttons at the same time. The purge procedure should be done after any maintenance has happened to your hydraulic system. To do the purge procedure, you'll extend your hydraulic jacks completely, and this may or may not lift your coach up off the ground, so you need to make sure that you are in a safe environment, nobody's around your coach when you are performing this procedure, and that you have any other safety precautions in place, like jack stands, if you're nervous about it falling. Since this is removing the air out of the lines, you've extended these jacks completely, and then you'll completely retract the jacks. You'll retract the jacks to their completely retracted travel position, and then you'll come to your reservoir and check your hydraulic fluid level. You'll refill as necessary, and if there's any foam or bubbles at the top, you'll wait for those to dissipate and repeat that procedure until all of those bubbles stop occurring.